Well, thank you for having me today. I want to thank Nina Rios for this opportunity to address you. I met some of you here recently. I met Maria Wellish, who was also, I guess, instrumental in bringing me here today. And I met your CEO briefly, Mr. Lowenberg, who was very nice when I visited here a couple of weeks back. So it's an honor for me to come here. It's a fine facility. I've been in practice in San Antonio for many years, and many of my patients have been at your facility, and I thank you for all your important caregiving and educational work that you do here in San Antonio. As you probably heard, I am a doctor, an internist and geriatrician, and also a writer and a storyteller. I'm going to tell you some personal stories today, and about why these stories are important for you to keep in mind as we go about our lives as caregivers. And no, I speak about physicians in much of what I say. All that I say is universal to us, patients and physicians and healthcare professionals of all kinds. This past August, 230 students began their first year of medical school here at the UT Health Science Center in San Antonio. And I dare say that all of them were anxious about what lay ahead for them, all the years of training to come. All of them are full of innate idealism and compassion for their fellow man. The first hour of their first day in medical school is given over to those of us who teach at the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics. And we proceed over the course of the next week to introduce these students to the basic principles of medical ethics, to engage their minds by presenting ethical dilemmas for them to discuss, and to engage their hearts by asking them to watch films and read and discuss stories and poems written about the experience of illness. It's our mission to nurture the empathic responsiveness that we feel burns inside these young doctors to be. And we continue to do this in various ways throughout all their years of medical school. Imagining the patient's experience is an encapsulation of what I believe to be the goal of this center. And the faculty there work hard to give students a variety of medical experiences through service learning opportunities in underserved populations here in San Antonio to places in the world as far away as Haiti and India and Ethiopia. And I've been a very small part of the endeavor of this center, but I believe that we are making a difference in the lives of these physicians in training. And as a result, I hope that they will make a difference in all of our lives one of these days. Dr. Sherwin Newland, who you may know as a surgeon and who is also a prolific physician writer, he wrote the bestseller How We Die a number of years ago. But he's just published a new book called The Uncertain Art, Thoughts on a Life in Medicine. He has this to say: writing is not an exercise in discretion. It is an exercise in seeking clues to our lives. In this sense, the story belongs to the storyteller, because the storyteller is the truth seeker. In my book, Memory Lessons, A Doctor's Story, I describe the events of my father's decline from aging, disability, and dementia. It's a personal story, yet I believe it's a universal one. In it, I seek to find my own truth about my relationship with my father, as well as with many others of my family, my friends, and my patients during my career in medicine. It's my hope that readers, professionals, as well as members of families struggling with loved ones at life's end, will find, through the prism of the stories I tell, a glimmer of their own truths. This is the earliest photo that exists of a medical school class of 1882 at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, which is my alma mater. And although I've been around a while, I'm not in this picture. The last couple of years, as I mentioned, I've had the privilege to stand before the first-year medical student class and tell them about my life as a doctor, especially about my family's struggle with my father. And the title of my talk is The Experience of Illness, A Walk in My Shoes. I posed several questions to these students who sit in front of me at that lecture. The first one is, who here this morning has some idea of pursuing a career in primary care medicine? That's family practice or internal medicine or pediatrics. Maybe a third of the students raise a hand. Then I asked, what about the primary care specialty area of geriatric medicine, the care of our nation's elderly? Perhaps 4 or 5 students raise a hand. And then I asked, are there any students here this morning who made a decision to pursue a career in medicine as a result of witnessing an illness in a loved one or a close friend? And almost every student present raises a hand. So these responses tell us a couple of things. The first is that not very many students are on track to do the kind of work I've done, or my medical group has done and continues to do. But the other thing is this, the tremendous power of personal stories, personal encounters with illness, to move us, to drive our lives in one direction or another. These encounters are what has brought many of us into medicine in the first place, and what keeps those of us who practice year after year motivated, that keeps our compassion and idealism honed. Why is it that many medical educators today believe that storytelling, or the field of narrative medicines as it's now called, is important in training students today? I'm going to give you some of the answers to this question, which are adapted from Dr. Rita Sharon's book, Narrative Medicine, came out a couple of years ago. She's one of the leaders in the field. Literary accounts of illness can teach physicians concrete and powerful lessons about the lives of sick people. Great works of fiction about medicine enable physicians to recognize the power and implications of what they do. Through the study of narrative, the physician can better understand patients' stories of sickness and his or her own personal stake in medical practice. Literary study contributes to physicians' expertise in narrative ethics, which is another way to view and analyze ethical issues that arise in the human moral drama of illness, and which is often particularly valuable in the context of cultural differences, which is becoming very, very important in our diverse society. The narrative process allows medical students and physicians not only to examine what they do in medicine, but what a career in medicine has done to them. Case histories of the physician's life can stimulate important personal introspection about an examination of all that the physician is called upon to do. After years of medical training and the stresses and tensions of medical practice, the narrative process, along with literary studies, can help physicians recognize their own affective selves and reorient them towards the generous goals of service and dedication for which they entered the profession to begin with. This evening, I'm going to tell you a story about my family. Here we are about 10 years ago, before our troubles began. This story is a distillation of my life in medicine and my life as my father's son, with an emphasis on caring for him in his oldest years. This is the only photograph I have of my paternal grandparents, Jacob and Elizabeth Winakur, who arrived in Baltimore about 1900 from somewhere in the Pale of Russian settlement. Neither spoke English. My father was not yet born when this picture was taken. He was the last of 6 children and came along in 1919. His father, Jacob, pictured here, died when my father was 7. My father often went fishing on the Chesapeake Bay with his older brother, Frank, who became his surrogate father. This may be the earliest picture of my dad that survives. After my father's father died, each child was taken in turn to run the small shop he had opened. It fell to my father at the age of 16 to begin his turn. He was plucked from high school 6 months shy of his graduation, and he never had the opportunity to pursue any other formal education. And that left him with an inferiority complex that unfortunately lasted the rest of his life. He met my mother, Frances, who waitressed in a small corner restaurant operated by her family that was across the street from my father's store. They didn't know each other well when my dad entered the service during World War II, but he carried this picture of her in his wallet for 5 years, and she wrote him every day, sealing each letter with a big lipstick kiss. When they returned from the service, the first thing they did was get married. They are on their wedding day in 1946, and as you can see from this picture, it looks as if they have pretty big plans for each other after the party. So I came along in 1948, and here I am with my mother. I have vivid memories of this old DeSoto. On my 12th birthday, the year was 1960, my dad gave me a copy of Roger Torrey Peterson's A Field Guide to the Birds of Eastern North America. All my young life, my dad had told me stories of his boyhood in Baltimore in the 20s and how he had fallen in love with birds and trekked through the woods following each new one until he could sneak up for a close look. He had no field guide then and no binoculars. After he memorized the birds' features, he would run to the library and look them up, and that's how he came to know the birds that inhabited the outskirts of Baltimore. And I remember that 12th birthday very well. We were sitting together, my dad and I, on the back stoop of our home on Green Meadow Parkway. And frankly, I was pouting a bit because really what I wanted was a baseball glove and not a field guide, because I really didn't share my father's interest in birds of the natural world. And I was half-heartedly thumbing through the pages of this bird guide, and I came across this rendering by Roger Peterson of an indigo bunting. And I have to tell you, it was a very vivid illustration. As you can see, this animated electrical blue color, and the bird really jumped off the page at me. And I asked my dad, I said, "Have you ever seen an indigo bunting?" "Sure," he said, "there's lots of them around here this time of year." And he was staring across our lawn. There was a weed-choked berm on the other side of the alley. And he pointed and he said, "There's one now." And my head came out of the book, and I was looking to find this bird, and I couldn't see it. And my dad reached around the back of himself and said, "Try these." And he handed me his pair of Army-issued binoculars that had always been on the top of his bedroom closet where I really wasn't allowed to go. And he gave them to me, and he said, "Happy birthday, Jerry boy." And he passed those binoculars into my hands and looked into my eyes. And I remember taking the glasses from him, and the bunting in perfect light came into focus and really was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my young life. And it began my interest in the natural world at that moment. And is it possible that one day I will forget this sight? Well, my father has forgotten all he ever knew about birds. In the end, most days he did not know I was his son. He was always pleased to see me, although much of the time I thought he was his brother. He thought I was his brother or some old friend whose name he couldn't remember. And at the end of our visits, he always said, "You ought to come around more often," even if I just left hours before. And after each visit with him, if he was still awake, I would say, "I love you, Dad." And it was always a surprise to me when he answered, "I love you too," because that was something he could never bring himself to say to me when I was his 12-year-old son or his 50-year-old son. But in his last years, he lost whatever inhibitions or whatever stern governor he had always had that prevented him from openly expressing his affection for me and my brother during the years when he was our father undiminished. This is one gift his progressive dementia has given us. Each indigo bunting remembers the migratory route back to his home ground, flown in a single spring night's mighty effort each year from the Yucatan Peninsula across the treeless black void of the Gulf of Mexico, guided by a map of the heavenly constellations imprinted in his brain. When land is at last in sight, he recognizes the coastline and river systems at the edge of the continent. On his final approach home, he recalls Pacific stands of sheltering live oaks, breathes in the smells of the local marsh. He is home again at last, and at dawn he whistles a song he heard his father sing years before. Without these memories, he is lost. We are, all of us in America today, and in modern Western culture in general, living in a society that is inexorably aging. Between 1900, when average life expectancy for a man was 47 years, and 2030, those over 65 in our country will have grown from 3 million people, or 4% of our population, to 72 million, 20% of our populace. Even more stunning are the numbers of the old, those between the ages of 75 and 84, and the oldest old, those over 85. The former group will more than double between 2000 and 2050, while the latter will more than quadruple to 18 million people. The oldest old are now the fastest growing demographic segment of our society. And while this increase in longevity speaks for the great success of certain medical advances, here is the price we pay. A very significant and growing number of people will suffer years of enfeeblement, disability, and dementia, eventually becoming incapable of caring for their own elementary needs. Here are some of the burdens we will find as our society continues to age. After age 85, only 1 person in 20 is fully mobile. 50% of people over age 85 will suffer a major cognitive impairment, or what we call dementia. In 2004, there were 4.5 million Americans with Alzheimer's disease. By 2050, the estimates are 11 to 18 million Americans may have this condition. So who's going to care for all these aging people in America? All of us have a great stake in this. Boomers like me will be among those aging patients, and at the present time, it is not at all clear who will be here to take care of us. Every year now, more geriatricians retire from practice and enter the field. I emphasize these statistics to my students as I try to nudge them towards a career in geriatric medicine. You will never lack for patients, I tell them. Folks who will be grateful for your knowledgeable and compassionate care. And guess what? Geriatricians have the highest job satisfaction of any medical specialty. The story of my father's life and his advancing old age is typical of one that many, if not most of us, will face. A life of accomplishments, disappointments, setbacks, illnesses, losses. And yet, in its own way, it is unique, one hard to summarize even for this doctor's son. But isn't that the way for most of us, of the lives lived by those we love? When my father was 60, the age I am now, he had his first heart attack. After surviving almost 5 years in the Army Air Corps, building a small business, losing it in one night in 1968, raising 2 sons, rediscovering his passion for art, and painting dozens of vibrant canvases, my father began his slow decline. At age 65, the year he qualified for Medicare, he had an even bigger heart attack that left him with a poorly functioning heart muscle. Then when he was 75, he developed prostate cancer and underwent a series of radiation treatments. At 81, he became short of breath. His doctor admitted him to the hospital with congestive heart failure. Within 2 days, he became confused and paranoid and delusional. His dementia had been unmasked. My brother or I stayed with him every night, fending off bed rails and IV poles, checking each pill he took, every fluid-filled bag plugged into his arm, running interference when he went to the bathroom or down to X-ray. When he became too agitated to rest, I reassured him with my hand on his arm or shoulder, told him stories of our bird-watching trips down on the Texas coast, or our fishing trips out on the Chesapeake when I was young. One night, to quell the demons of his delirium, I crawled into bed with him, tried to comfort him, as he has done for me a lifetime ago. My father's physician, Dr. John Galan, is one of my associates. He's an excellent doctor and a sweet man. And at the time of his last inpatient stay, I was the medical director of the skilled nursing unit at my hospital. And Dr. Galan, who recognized that my father was deconditioned and sleep-deprived, recommended that he spend some time in this unit in the hopes that he would improve. This was heartfelt and reasonable advice. However, after 4 days in the hospital, I took my father home, although he was not yet ready to leave, because I knew as a geriatrician that if I did not get him home, he would never come back again. A continued prolonged stay in another unfamiliar environment would have only added to my father's confusion and agitation, would have required more medications, and possibly have engendered more side effects. A stay at that time for my father in the skilled nursing unit would have just been a way station to placement in a long-term custodial nursing home. And so my family took my dad home. I intended to keep my father there until the sounds of his breathing ceased in the bedroom where he'd slept every night for the last 29 years. And I intended to be there by his side. It was then that I began to write about the experience of his illness. The first essay that came out of that experience was published in Health Affairs and was called "What Are We Going to Do with Dad?" It was an early narrative about his disease process. This essay got excerpted in the Washington Post and one Sunday morning in 2005. And that morning, when I checked my email, I had 500 emails in my inbox. Thousands followed over the ensuing months as this article was syndicated in newspapers across the country and after I was interviewed on National Public Radio a couple of times. I have to tell you, I wasn't prepared for that because I've spent the last now almost 34 years trying to solve patients' problems, patients like Dorothy here. We went through a lot together, she and I. But I've always been a problem solver, sort of one-on-one, one patient at a time in exam rooms and consultation rooms or the bedsides in hospitals or nursing homes. I'm not a research scientist or a policy person or a philosopher or a sage or a guru. I'm just a doctor, an internist, a geriatrician, a man who's done his best to listen carefully to each patient in turn and confront every issue with a reasonable fund of knowledge, a modicum of common sense, and a large dose of honesty. But during the time my essay received such wide attention, I was deluged with problems coming at me every day at an order of magnitude greater than I, in my worst nightmares as a clinician, ever thought I could handle. I brought up my email during these months with a feeling of inadequacy. I want you to hear some of those voices and those stories. From a daughter. I was responsible for the decisions, health, financial, and otherwise, for my mother and her sister until their deaths in a nursing home. Both had Alzheimer's. I have seen the best of the human animal and the worst. Another daughter wrote, I'm trying not to be overwhelmed by the enormous burden of guilt of not being there to see my father regularly. Another daughter wrote me, my mother is one of the old, and because of her multiple health problems, she will never be active again. As my family has dealt with Mom's declining health, it seems the only thing that no one wants to admit is that anyone is ever going to die. A son wrote, to take my dad back to his apartment would require 24/7 vigilance, over $14,000 a month, none of which is covered by Medicare or insurance. What do we do? I'm tripping, stumbling, falling, wondering if I will ever have a life again, and scared to death of what we will do when the money runs out. From a gerontologist. My mom was on the edge of a coma for the last 2 weeks of her life, and I was giving her morphine. Every time I gave her a dose, I was tempted to give her too much because it would have been so easy to do, and no one would have questioned it. I was receiving dozens and dozens of messages like these from families every day. I did my best to answer each and every one. I listened. I dispensed reassurance. Whenever it was appropriate, I tried to understand anger and urge forgiveness, assuage guilt. But who am I to be doing this? Was the recurring thought. Those of you who have read this essay know very well that for my own father, I offered no pan answers and no easy solutions. I did my best to muddle through every day with my dad as each new problem arose. Incontinence, personality change, belligerence, loss of appetite, falls, and on through the whole gamut of geriatric syndromes I deal with in my patients every year, year after year. Still, when it came to my own father, I was often at a loss. Somewhere in the midst of coping with all these emails, trying to say the right thing, balancing my professional training with my own personal grief over my dad, over all the families struggling with loved ones at life's end, I had a revelation. The people writing to me were, for the most part, not looking for answers. They wanted to tell me their stories, just as I had told them mine. They wanted someone to hear them, to listen, to understand their sadness, their frustration, their losses, their suffering. And who better to turn to, they thought after reading my essay? A doctor who admits he doesn't have all the answers, the imperfect son of an old, old man. One of the great lessons I've learned as I worked at my profession over the years is that the art of medicine is the honed ability to listen. The practice of medicine, at least the day-to-day, year-in, year-out doctoring that I do, involves in large measure the interpretation of stories. Words, not data, nuance, not numbers, are the commodities exchanged between my patients and me. I ask a few questions over and over, but the answers come in an infinite variety. By listening to our patients' stories, doctors glean and process most of the information we need in order to treat not only ailing bodies, but also to care for our fellow humans as unique beings. It is my job to evaluate and formulate from a constellation of symptoms and concerns and worries, from a blizzard of outside data of often questionable validity. You add to this a mix of freighted family and past medical history, a tendency towards superstition and fears, and a conglomeration of tidbits and details picked up in the mass media or from well-meaning friends. And I have also learned that it is not necessarily what patients tell me, but what they don't tell me, what I observe from years of being alert to nonverbal cues, that is often even more important. Those of us who aspire to become true diagnosticians, but who are unwilling or incapable of reading this invisible text, who study only a checkmark questionnaire scrawled by the patient while she sat in another room, or who stare remotely into a computer monitor at a robotic encounter, never understand, never begin to hear the complete story. On February 24, 2006, my family celebrated my parents' 60th wedding anniversary. Here they are, Francis and Leonard, on this occasion. My father passed away just 4 days after this picture was taken. He was 87. My family, especially my mother, worked hard the last 6 years or so of his life to keep him at home and comfortable. And I kept my promise. My father never went back into the hospital. And one reason I was able to keep him at home was that I remained his advocate until the end, just as I've tried to be, sometimes with more success than at other times, the advocate for many hundreds of my patients over the years. Being an advocate for our patients and our loved ones is a difficult and painful process because these decisions at life's end are topics we and our culture find difficult to engage each other in. But it is essential that we try, and here is why. Because as healers, this is the first step to help ease suffering. Who is it that suffers in these end-of-life scenarios? Often it is no longer the patients. The families are suffering. Parents and siblings and spouses and children and close friends. These people watch a loved one diminish, retreat from life into the shell of a former self, one that can no longer communicate or laugh or cry or respond in the old ways, let alone meaningful ways. Many doctors know how to relieve physical pain, but most of us fail to treat suffering, the existential morass of losses before actual death, of independence, mutually supportive companionship, of selfhood, of fear of the unknown. We often fail our patients and their families because we avoid their gaze and their hard questions, fearing what we ourselves might see in their eyes. When I was young, my father would occasionally turn to me and say, "You think you'll ever amount to anything, Jerry boy?" In my early years, when I had my whole life ahead of me and my father still had most of his, he asked this, of course, rhetorically. Sure, I would amount to something. He would see to it. Still, the question always took me aback. What did I know then? I remember as a boy mumbling, "I guess so," Or I don't know, Dad, or quit asking me that. My father became an old man after he lost his business and his self-esteem, after his bouts with depression, after his wife went back to work to support him, after he lost his health, and finally his memory. That question he once posed to me would pop out of him from time to time, though its form had subtly changed. "Do you think we'll ever amount to anything?" he would sometimes ask. In his last years, I tried to reassure. I spoke of my children, his grandchildren, my medical practice. My father listened, nodded his head, had little to say. I did not understand what he was asking of me then. 3 months before my father died, I received a letter from a literary agent confirming that she had sold my book proposal to a publisher. The evening I received this good news, I took the letter over to my parents' house. My mother was thrilled, kissed both my cheeks. "You have to tell your father," she said. I knew that I should, and I wanted to, but I feared he might not understand. I worried that the news might upset him somehow. And no matter what, in 10 minutes, he would forget what I told him anyway. My father was in bed. He had refused dinner once again. He had just about stopped eating by then. I cajoled him up into his walker as I had done so many times. I followed him down the short hallway from his bedroom and through the living room where my mother sat in front of the TV. I helped him to his feet, into his seat at the kitchen table, and filled a glass with a chocolate nutritional supplement and set out his evening medications. I encouraged him to drink, to take his pills. I waited until he was finished. "Dad," I said, "I'm writing a book." "Really? A whole book all by yourself?" "All by myself," I said. He slumped a bit in his chair and then glanced sideways at me. "It's not about me, is it?" "As a matter of fact, Dad," I said, "you're the star of the book." "No one will read it," he said. "Dad, the book is about our family, growing up together, getting old together, dealing with sickness and aging. People will want to hear about your life story, about our story." "I don't think so," he said. "I'm getting sleepy now. Take me back to bed." "Dad, see if you can read this letter, or I'll read it to you, please." He took it from my hand and began reading. I watched his lips move, and then he stopped, sat up straight as he could, turned to me, and looked into my eyes. He had a sparkle in his, a half smile on his face. "Are you BSing me?" he asked. "It's the truth, Dad." "A book about me?" I wanted to say something else, but the words wouldn't come. I could only nod my head like a child. I called out to my mother, "Mom, is this true?" She hit the mute button on the TV remote. "It's true," she called from the living room. In a gesture that had not passed between us in many years, my father extended his shaky hand to me. I took it into my own, squeezed it, shook it. His hand was bony, but very warm. "I guess we amounted to something after all," he said. His voice broke, and his face was wet with tears. "Yes, you did," I told him. Now I actually had to write the book, and at first I didn't think I could. But as my father descended deeper and deeper into his dementia, the thought of him holding it in his hands, even if he could no longer read, kept me going. I chronicled our life together, the good times and the bad, the often prickly nature of our relationship, his love of bird watching in the natural world, these gifts he passed on to me. When he suffered bouts of agitation and delirium, I wrote. And when he no longer recognized me, I wrote. When he stopped eating and became incontinent, I wrote. When his gait deteriorated and he fell again and again, well, I wrote about that too. I wrote about our society's negative view of aging and the uneven and sometimes sad state of elder care in America today. I wrote about the changes in medical education and medical practice that I have witnessed during my career, about how today only a tiny fraction of doctors want to dedicate their lives to caring for the oldest among us, and what that will mean to all Americans. I wrote about the family members and friends who nurtured me, the elderly folks, my patient, who regard me as their surrogate son, and what they have taught me about living well and dying with grace. I wrote about the mistakes I have made as their doctor and how I have come to terms with those mistakes and learned from them. I wrote my life, and the writing went on for over 2 years after my father passed away. I put much that I have learned as a doctor and as a person, as a human, into this book, and at some point I probably took it out again or put it in another place. I didn't think I would ever finish the book, and the day came when I realized that I didn't want to finish it. But I had a contract and a deadline, and when I turned in the final manuscript, my mourning of my father began, because I finally had to let him go. That was over a year now, and I've been through all the stages of grief during that time. The process of working on my book and thinking back over my life as a doctor and caring for my dad during those years has rekindled in me the idealism and the innate compassion that most of us have when we come into medicine. Those of us who do what we do and preside over the many losses we inevitably sustain need an opportunity now and then to have our empathic responsiveness retuned. I also hope that at the end of his life I became a better son to my father. We had a complex relationship, like most fathers and sons, mothers and daughters. And I wasn't without feelings of guilt when he passed away, and I reach out to patients and families in my book Memory Lessons in passages like these. You are there alone in the house with your debilitated or demented loved one. You have flown in from across the continent and are now at the bedside of your father or mother in a hospital ICU, wondering what to do next as the respirator hisses and clicks in the corner. You pace the halls of the nursing home as the aides finally come to clean the excrement from your mother's bottom, apply the protective unguents to the inflamed flesh. Or you sit again at a bedside, watching as a bag of opaque liquid is pumped drop by drop through the plastic tubing which snakes under the sheets and into the stomach of someone you once knew and still love. You feel guilty and powerless and abandoned and angry and bereft. You have decisions to make and no one to guide you. Your father's doctor or some anonymous care team on daily rounds floats in and out of the room very early or very late. You think they are trying to avoid you on purpose, your difficult questions. And maybe they are. Your own children live far away. Your siblings are obstinate or in denial or still angry over some long ago slight, some falling out which seems silly now. You are afraid that you will make a mistake, decide the wrong thing, choose the wrong path. Honor thy father and thy mother. Your head spins. Oh God, how can I not feed her through this tube? If I demand it be removed, if I discontinue this infernal respirator, I know he will die. The doctor says she must go back into the hospital to treat this pneumonia again. How many times can she survive this? Is this hurting him? Would she want this? If I say enough, am I committing a sin? Murder? Will Mom forgive me? My sister? Will I ever be able to forgive myself? When it is finally your husband or wife's or your mother's or father's time to go, when the heart monitor falls silent, the respirator ceases with a sigh, the hum of the feeding pump fades away, the chest settles for the last time, you will most likely feel some measure of guilt. You will wonder if you gave up the fight too soon, or perhaps you hung in there, bruised and bleeding, another round or two, almost beyond your endurance. You may be disappointed in the healthcare system, your doctor, the hospital, the nursing home. You may want to blame someone, some institution, and there is, unfortunately, oftentimes plenty of blame to go around. But bearing this guilt, carrying this anger, will not ease any suffering, will not bring your loved one back, will not help you heal, and will not prepare you for the next loss, the next ordeal which is coming. Devote whatever energies you can to muster to being kinder, more understanding, and more loving to those who are still on this earth and to whom you are still responsible. And save some for yourself, because you will need it. And here is something else I thought a lot about as I was working on this book. How we Americans view the aging process. Here's the heart of the problem as I see it. We as a society do not value our fellow countrymen who have the audacity to get old. Just see who makes it onto the front cover of the AARP magazine each month. Celebrities made over almost to the point of being unrecognizable. There would never be a photo of my father there. And this attitude is reflected in almost every aspect of American life, including the kind of work doctors in training pursue after medical school. Just a few short months ago, I thought I had reason to be optimistic about my chosen field of medicine. 3 of America's oldest old were showcased by men who will lead our nation. President Obama's grandmother, Vice President Biden's, and Senator McCain's white-haired mothers were prominent during the campaign season. Each candidate spoke reverentially of the important role his elder played in his life. I hope that the images of these strong women displayed in old photographs, their interviews on talk media, and their appearance on podiums holding the hands of their sons were not just attempts to garner votes in Florida and Arizona. Right now, as I've mentioned, primary care medicine is in, according to the American College of Physicians, is in a state of collapse. That's their words, not mine. And the number of medical students choosing this field has fallen by 50% in just the last few years. While every 8 seconds a boomer turns 60, the number of certified geriatricians in America has declined 20% in 10 years to only 7,000. Physician ranks grow by a mere 300 new geriatricians each year, fewer than those retiring. In 2003, only 2% of physicians in the residency portion of their training programs indicated an interest in geriatric medicine. In 2005, there was but 1 geriatrician for every 5,000 patients over the age of 65. In 2008, 1 for every 8,000 patients. Currently, America has a deficit of 14,000 geriatricians that will grow to 34,000 by 2030. This critical deficiency is not even on the radar screens of too many of our policymakers. The Alzheimer's Disease Study Group just out makes glancing reference to this deficiency in an appendix. And it's not only a doctor shortage that we face. All the members of the geriatric team, nurses, therapists, social workers, care managers, psychologists, and trained aides are scarce as well. 1 million RNs will retire in the next few years with few to replace them. Healthcare employees in too many long-term care facilities are woefully overworked, underpaid, undertrained, and suffer the highest rates of depression of any group of workers in the nation. And yet, they are the ones primarily responsible for the hour-by-hour, shift-by-shift care of our loved ones in long-term care, our grandparents, our mothers and fathers, and soon we ourselves. I want to tell you about another email I received after my essay was published in 2005. It was from an educated man, an accountant, who found himself responsible for the care of his elderly aunt and uncle. He did some homework, made some calculations, came to a decision. He found a long-term care facility for his aunt and uncle in Costa Rica. Out of sight, out of mind. Is outsourcing the care of our aging loved ones the next big thing in globalization? Who will visit them, advocate for them, celebrate birthdays and anniversaries with them? Who will value them so they will, in turn, still feel valuable? I was the first person in my extended family to go to college. My mother and father worked 6-day weeks in this shop handed down from my grandfather to send me, their firstborn son, away to school so that I might have more opportunities in life than they had, to be able to take my best shot at the American dream. I'm sure many of you grew up in such families. In 1965, I was a freshman at Bucknell University. In the middle of that first semester, I ended up in the hospital with pneumonia and missed 2 weeks of classes. I was behind in my work, afraid I might fail organic chemistry. I was homesick and depressed. My mother and father drove up to Lewisburg one Sunday. They picked me up from my dorm, drove me to a park on the banks of the Susquehanna River. My father and I walked along the water's edge. It was late autumn and the leaves were turning and dropping. We didn't speak. The river was running strong and would have drowned out our voices anyway. He had brought our binoculars and pointed into the low branches of the sycamore hanging over the water. I saw my first ever yellowthroat, but there was no thrill in it for me that day. My parents made sure I had a good solid meal at a restaurant. My mother every hour or so would turn to me and ask, "Are you okay now?" Sure, I said, I'm fine. My father said nothing. They stayed with me until the sun was setting. They would drive back to Baltimore in the dark. At the men's quad, we lingered over our goodbyes. My parents were about to pull away. I was hanging onto the car, leaning in through my mother's window. Wait, I said. I want to go back with you. But the semester, my mother said, your education. I'll work with Dad in the shop, I said. One day I'll take over. My father looked across my mother at me. There was sadness and resignation in his face. He sighed, but then he took a breath, stared into my eyes, and said with the great force he managed to muster from deep inside, "You're staying here." But Dad, I don't think I can do this. "You're staying here," he said, and he rolled up the window and drove away. Years later, my mother told me that he cried like a child on the 4-hour drive home. In that one moment of my life, by that one instinctive action on the part of my uneducated, my unsophisticated father, who expected his son to amount to something, who had pride and confidence in that son, even though that young man was uncertain and afraid, is the reason I stand before you today. Not because of the book I have written, but because of my father. So today I'm asking you to join with me in our quest for better, more holistic and compassionate medical care for all of us, but especially for our elderly. Let's insist as medical professionals and as citizens that our nation invest in the well-being of our elderly. Let's improve and rethink the infrastructure that is critical to their care in their old years. If America is about to spend more than $1 trillion on as yet unspecified rebuilding projects, let's allocate some of this into training those specialized in caring for the oldest among us, and to research aimed at reducing frailty and improving quality of life in newly imagined settings. Let's provide more and better assistance to families who want to keep their relatives at home. Let's continue to professionalize the elder care workforce, award advanced certification for added achievement, along with commensurate pay increases and benefits. We need these folks. Folks like you, millions and millions of them. Their hands-on work, compassion, and skills. Their importance, their mission will only grow as our society ages. These are jobs that should not be outsourced, skills that can be honed here in America and used to benefit all of us as the years go by. Remind the critics and the cynics, the policy wonks, the politicos, the captains of industry, the bureaucrats at Medicare, our medical educators, our unenlightened non-geriatric physicians in this country, the editors of our hometown newspapers, our neighbors, and even our family and our own children, that these elderly, wise, and generous human beings for whom we care are our grandparents, our parents. They are us. I'm going to close my talk today with a poem by Lee Robinson, my lawyer, poet, wife, and my co-instructor here in San Antonio at the Center for Medical Humanities and Ethics. Read. If you ask me what I believe in, it is the body of the 90-year-old straining to stand upright, each vertebra a testament, each muscle a miracle. It is the shape of her head, a sculpture the artist has been working on for centuries, the skull visible under the veil of skin. And if you ask me for a sermon, I will give you that skin, every wrinkle a parable. If you insist upon sacrament, I say, take her hand in yours. It is the only way to save yourself. Fold your flesh into her bones until you do not have to ask me anymore what to believe in. It is the body. Amen.